The automated doors of the grocery store should have opened smoothly, the way they had thousands of times before. Instead, they stuttered halfway, caught me mid-stride, and sent my canvas bag tumbling to the concrete. Apples rolled in every direction like scattered thoughts, canned goods clanked against the sidewalk, and my carefully folded receipt fluttered away on an evening breeze that seemed to mock my perpetual clumsiness. I stood there for a moment, frozen in that particular brand of mortification that comes with being 28 and still unable to navigate the world without some small catastrophe announcing my presence. The automatic doors finally gave up their mechanical seizure and slid open with what sounded suspiciously like a mechanical sigh of resignation. "Here, let me help you with that." The voice came from behind me, deeper than I expected, with the kind of warmth that suggested its owner had seen enough of life's small disasters to find them endearing rather than embarrassing. I turned to see a man crouched down, already gathering my escaped groceries with the methodical care of someone who understood that rushing only made things worse. He was older than me, maybe late 40s, early 50s, with salt and pepper hair that caught the amber glow of the grocery store's exterior lighting. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and I found myself watching the way his fingers wrapped around each wayward apple, gentle but certain. There was something about the deliberate nature of his movements that made me forget momentarily about my own embarrassment. "Thank you," I managed, dropping to my knees to help salvage what remained of my dignity and my dinner plans. "I swear these doors have it out for me." He smiled then, and it transformed his entire face. The lines around his eyes deepened in a way that spoke of decades of genuine laughter, not just polite social responses. I've noticed they've been particularly vindictive lately. Last week they trapped Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B with her cat carrier. Poor Whiskers nearly had a nervous breakdown. I found myself smiling back, surprised by the easy familiarity in his voice. "You live in the Riverside complex? Building C, 3rd floor?" He handed me the last of my canned soup, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was so fleeting I might have imagined it, but something in the way he paused made me think he'd felt it too. "I'm Leonard." "Owen." I straightened up, clutching my battered groceries against my chest like armor. "Building B, 2nd floor. I can't believe we've never run into each other before." "Different schedules, probably." Leonard's eyes lingered on my face for a moment longer than strictly necessary for polite conversation. "I work downtown. Marketing firm. Usually don't make it home until after 7. "That explains it. I'm usually dead to the world by then." I shifted the weight of my groceries, suddenly aware of how rumpled I must look after my battle with the automatic doors. "I work early shifts at the coffee shop on Maple Street. Up at 4:30 most mornings." Something shifted in Leonard's expression, a flicker of recognition mixed with what might have been concern. "The little place with the blue awning?" "I drive past there every morning on my way to work." I nodded, surprised by the warmth that spread through my chest at the thought of him noticing my workplace, even in passing. "That's the one. Best coffee in the neighborhood, if I do say so myself." "I'll have to stop by sometime." The words hung between us, carrying more weight than a simple statement about coffee preferences should. "I mean, if you don't mind having your boss drop by unannounced." "You're not my boss," I said, then immediately felt heat rise to my cheeks as I realized how that might sound. "I mean, obviously you're not, but also, you wouldn't be dropping by unannounced if I'm inviting you, which I am. Inviting you, that is." Leonard's smile widened, and I caught a glimpse of something almost boyish in his expression despite the silver threading through his hair. "I'd like that." We stood there for another moment, the automatic doors opening and closing behind us as other shoppers came and went. The evening air carried the scent of someone's barbecue and the distant sound of children playing in the complex's courtyard. It was such an ordinary moment, two neighbors meeting over scattered groceries, but something about Leonard's presence made it feel significant in a way I couldn't quite name. "I should let you get those groceries home before the ice cream melts," Leonard said eventually, gesturing toward my bag. I looked down, suddenly remembering the pint of chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream I'd bought as a reward for surviving another week. Right. Can't have a domestic crisis on top of a grocery store crisis. That would be tragedy of epic proportions, Leonard agreed, his tone so solemn that I laughed despite myself. Exactly. I have a reputation to maintain as someone who can at least keep ice cream frozen, even if I can't master automatic doors. Leonard's laugh was low and rich, the kind of sound that seemed to resonate somewhere in my chest. I have faith in your ice cream management abilities. Your confidence means everything to me, I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it more than the joke warranted. We parted ways at the complex entrance, Leonard heading toward Building C, while I trudged toward Building B. I found myself walking slower than usual, turning back once to catch sight of his tall frame disappearing through his building's entrance. Something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed but not rigid, purposeful but not hurried, made me wonder what his apartment looked like, whether he lived alone, what he did with his evenings after those long days at the marketing firm. My own apartment greeted me with its familiar silence. 2 bedrooms because it was all I could afford when I'd moved in 3 years ago, back when I'd harbored illusions about having friends over regularly, or maybe even dating someone seriously enough to justify the extra space. Now, the 2nd bedroom served as a storage room for art supplies and half-finished projects, dreams deferred until I could figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. I put away my groceries with unusual care, each item finding its designated place in cabinets that were probably too organized for a 28-year-old who lived alone and worked at a coffee shop. But routines had always been my anchor, the thing that kept me tethered when everything else felt uncertain. Wake up, shower, coffee, work, groceries, dinner, sketch for an hour, sleep. Repeat until weekend, then fill the empty spaces with longer sketching sessions and the kind of solitude that had once felt peaceful, but increasingly felt hollow. The ice cream found its way into my freezer next to a collection of frozen dinners that served as testament to my complete lack of culinary ambition. I stood there for a moment with the freezer door open, letting the cold air wash over my face while I replayed the conversation with Leonard. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at me, a kind of recognition that went deeper than neighborly politeness. Or maybe I was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. Maybe Leonard helped everyone who had grocery-related disasters outside the market. Maybe he was just one of those genuinely nice people who existed in the world to balance out all the ones who walked past others' misfortunes without a second glance. But the way he'd said my name when I introduced myself, like he was trying it out, testing how it felt in his mouth, that had seemed like something more than casual neighborliness. I closed the freezer and leaned against it, letting the reality of my empty apartment settle around me like a familiar blanket. This was my life, safe, predictable, contained within boundaries I'd carefully constructed to avoid the kind of messiness that came with letting people too close. I went to work, I came home, I sketched pictures of things that interested me, but never people, because people were complicated and unpredictable and had a way of leaving when you started depending on them. Leonard was probably just being polite when he said he'd stop by the coffee shop. People said things like that all the time without meaning them. Social pleasantries that smoothed over the awkwardness of chance encounters but weren't meant to be taken literally. I'd learned not to build expectations around casual promises years ago, back when disappointment still had the power to surprise me. But as I heated up a frozen dinner and settled onto my couch with my sketchbook, I found myself thinking about his hands as he'd gathered my scattered groceries. The way he'd moved with such careful deliberation, as if my escaped apples were precious objects deserving of gentle treatment rather than everyday items to be grabbed quickly and forgotten. And his smile. God, his smile had been so unexpected, transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made my chest feel tight in ways I wasn't quite ready to examine. I opened my sketchbook to a fresh page and started drawing without conscious thought, my pencil moving across the paper in familiar patterns. It wasn't until I'd been working for several minutes that I realized I was sketching Leonard's face, trying to capture the way his eyes had crinkled when he laughed about my ice cream management abilities. The drawing wasn't very good. I'd always been better at landscapes and objects than people, but something about the act of trying to recreate his expression felt important, like I was holding on to a moment that might otherwise fade into the forgettable backdrop of ordinary life. I sketched until my hand cramped and my frozen dinner had gone cold, filling 3 pages with different attempts at capturing Leonard's face from memory. None of them quite right, but each one a little closer to something that felt real. By the time I gave up and went to bed, it was past midnight, and I was no closer to understanding why a simple act of kindness from a neighbor had affected me so profoundly. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling restless and oddly hopeful in a way that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The next morning arrived with its usual pre-dawn darkness, and the harsh sound of my alarm clock dragging me from whatever peaceful oblivion I'd finally found. I went through my morning routine on autopilot. Shower, coffee, toast I barely tasted, the walk to work through empty streets that would be bustling with life in a few hours, but for now belonged only to the early risers and the insomniacs finally giving up on sleep. The coffee shop was my sanctuary in those quiet morning hours before we opened. I had 30 minutes to myself to set up the machines, arrange the pastries in their display case, and pretend that I was the kind of person who had chosen this life rather than simply fallen into it. The work was mindless enough to be soothing, but engaging enough to keep me from dwelling too much on thoughts that had no productive outlet. Marcus, my manager and the owner's nephew, arrived at exactly 6:45 like always, carrying the subtle scent of whatever cologne had seemed like a good idea when he was getting ready, but now felt overwhelming in the small space of our shop. He was a good guy, despite his tendency toward micromanagement and his conviction that every customer interaction was an opportunity for upselling. "Morning, sunshine," he said, already reaching for his own coffee mug. "You look like hell." "Good morning to you too, Marcus." I finished arranging the last of the blueberry scones and closed the display case. "I look like someone who gets up at 4:30 in the morning to make sure you have fresh coffee." Fair point. He took a long sip of coffee and made the satisfied noise he made every morning, like this was the first time he'd ever tasted our dark roast blend. "You okay, though? You seem, I don't know, different." I considered telling him about Leonard, about the strange encounter that had left me feeling unsettled in ways I couldn't quite articulate. But Marcus and I had a work friendship, the kind that functioned perfectly within the boundaries of scheduled shifts and shared frustration with difficult customers, but didn't extend much beyond the coffee shop's walls. Talking about Leonard would require explanations I wasn't ready to give, about loneliness and the way a stranger's kindness could crack open feelings I'd been keeping carefully locked away. "Just tired," I said instead. "Didn't sleep well." "You never sleep well. That's what happens when you go to bed at 9 o'clock like somebody's grandfather." Marcus flipped the sign from closed to open and unlocked the front door. "You need to get out more, meet people, have some fun." It was an old conversation between us, one that usually ended with me making non-committal sounds while Marcus launched into stories about his weekend adventures that invariably involved too much alcohol and too little judgment. But this morning his words hit differently, carrying an edge of truth that made me uncomfortable. "I get out," I said weakly. "Going to the grocery store doesn't count as getting out." Marcus adjusted the chairs around our small tables with the kind of precision that suggested he'd given this lecture before. "Neither does your weekly trip to the art supply store. You need to meet actual humans, Owen, preferably ones who aren't paying you to make their coffee." The first customers of the day began trickling in before I could formulate a response that wouldn't involve admitting he was right. The morning rush started slowly. A few regulars who needed their caffeine fix before facing the world, a handful of commuters grabbing something quick on their way to jobs they probably didn't love any more than I loved mine. I fell into the familiar rhythm of taking orders, making drinks, handling the register with the kind of efficiency that came from 3 years of repetitive motion. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the bell above the door chimed and I looked up to see Leonard walking in, looking somehow both exactly as I remembered and completely different in the morning light. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him well without being showy, and his hair was still slightly damp, like he'd rushed through his morning routine. But it was his eyes that made me forget what I was doing. They found mine immediately, with the kind of directness that suggested he'd been thinking about this moment as much as I had. "Good morning," he said, approaching the counter with that same careful deliberation I'd noticed the night before. "I hope you don't mind that I took you up on your invitation." "Not at all." My voice came out slightly higher than normal, and I cleared my throat. "I mean, of course. What can I get for you?" Leonard studied the menu board behind me with more attention than our limited selection probably warranted. "What do you recommend?" "Depends on what you like. Are you a coffee purist or do you prefer something with more personality?" "Surprise me," he said, and there was something in his tone that made the simple request feel like a challenge. I turned to the espresso machine, suddenly hyper-aware of Leonard's presence on the other side of the counter. I could feel him watching me work, and instead of making me nervous, it made me want to show off a little. I pulled shots with extra care, steamed milk to the perfect temperature, and created a pattern in the foam that was more elaborate than anything I usually bothered with for the morning rush. "Vanilla latte with an extra shot," I said, sliding the cup across the counter. And I may have gotten a little artistic with the foam. Leonard picked up the cup and examined the design I'd created, a stylized leaf that had turned out better than I'd expected. "This is beautiful. Almost too pretty to drink. It's just foam art, nothing fancy." "I disagree." Leonard took a careful sip, and I found myself holding my breath while he tasted it. "This is excellent. You've definitely earned a new regular customer." The warmth in his voice made something flutter in my chest, and I had to look away to hide what I was sure was a ridiculous smile. "I'm glad you like it." "Owen." The way he said my name made me look back at him. "Would you mind if I sat here for a few minutes? I'm not expected at the office until 10. I glanced around the coffee shop, which had emptied out after the morning rush. Marcus was in the back doing inventory, and we probably wouldn't see another customer for at least half an hour. "Of course. Make yourself comfortable." Leonard chose a table by the window, positioning himself so that he could see both the street outside and the counter where I was pretending to busy myself with unnecessary cleaning tasks. Every few minutes our eyes would meet, and he'd smile in a way that made me forget what I was supposed to be doing. "So," he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "how long have you been working here?" 3 years. I abandoned my pretense of wiping down already clean surfaces and moved closer to his table. "Started right after I moved to the neighborhood." "What did you do before this?" It was such a simple question, but it opened up territories I usually tried to avoid in casual conversation. "I was in art school. Fine arts program at the state university. But I ran out of money and motivation around the same time, so I took what was supposed to be a temporary job making coffee and somehow never left." Leonard nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of art?" "Drawing, mostly. Some painting. I was never very good at the conceptual stuff that professors loved. I just liked capturing things that caught my eye." I realized I was oversharing and felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Sorry, you probably don't want to hear about my failed artistic ambitions." "Actually, I'd like to hear more." Leonard leaned forward slightly, and I caught a hint of his cologne, something subtle and masculine that made me want to move closer. "What kinds of things catch your eye?" The question felt loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. "Architecture, mostly. Old buildings, interesting doorways, the way light hits things at certain times of day. Nothing very exciting." I think that sounds very exciting. Leonard's voice was sincere in a way that made me believe he actually meant it. There's something beautiful about noticing the details that other people walk past without seeing. We were interrupted by Marcus emerging from the back room with his arms full of coffee bean bags, but not before I caught something in Leonard's expression that made my pulse quicken. He wasn't just being polite. He was genuinely interested in what I had to say, in the things that mattered to me but that I'd learned not to talk about because most people's eyes glazed over when the conversation turned to art. "I should probably get going," Leonard said, checking his watch. "But I meant what I said about becoming a regular." "Same time tomorrow?" "I'll be here." The words came out more eagerly than I'd intended, but Leonard's smile suggested he didn't mind my enthusiasm. "Good." He stood up, leaving his empty cup on the table. "And Owen? Thank you for the recommendation. It was perfect." I watched him leave through the front window, following his tall frame until he disappeared around the corner toward the downtown business district. Marcus appeared at my elbow with the kind of knowing expression that made me want to disappear into the floor. "Well, well, well," he said, drawing out each word with theatrical emphasis. "Who was that tall drink of water?" "Just a neighbor," I said quickly, turning back to the counter to avoid Marcus's scrutinizing gaze. "Just a neighbor who had you blushing like a schoolgirl and making foam art that actually looks like something instead of abstract blob number 47. I couldn't argue with that observation, mainly because it was completely accurate. "He's nice. We met at the grocery store yesterday." "Nice," Marcus repeated, like he was testing the word. "And single?" "I have no idea." The lie came easily, but even as I said it, I realized I'd been wondering the same thing. Leonard didn't wear a wedding ring. I'd noticed that while he was gathering my scattered groceries, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. We barely know each other. "Yet," Marcus said with the kind of confidence that suggested he could see a future I was afraid to imagine. "But something tells me that's going to change real fast." The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and distracted thoughts. I found myself replaying every moment of Leonard's visit, analyzing each word and gesture for hidden meaning. The way he'd said my name, the genuine interest in his voice when he asked about my art, the careful way he'd approached asking if he could stay and talk for a few minutes. It all felt significant in ways that scared and thrilled me in equal measure. By the time my shift ended at 2 o'clock, I'd convinced myself that I was reading too much into what was probably just friendliness from a naturally warm person. Leonard was older, established, professionally successful, the kind of man who probably had his life figured out in ways I couldn't even imagine. What could he possibly see in a 28-year-old barista who lived paycheck to paycheck and had never managed to finish anything he'd started? But as I walked home through the afternoon sunshine, I couldn't shake the memory of how he'd looked at me when I'd handed him his coffee. Like I was something worth paying attention to, worth listening to, worth coming back for tomorrow morning. My apartment felt different when I let myself in, charged with possibility in a way that made me restless. I tried to settle into my usual afternoon routine, lunch, an hour of sketching, maybe a walk around the neighborhood if the weather was nice, but everything felt hollow and pointless. Instead, I found myself standing in front of my bedroom mirror, examining my reflection with the kind of critical attention I usually reserved for my artwork. I wasn't ugly exactly, but I wasn't particularly remarkable either. Average height, brown hair that never quite did what I wanted it to do, eyes that Marcus had once described as soulful, but that I'd always thought were just brown. My face was fine, I supposed. Symmetrical enough, no obvious flaws, but it was the kind of face that blended into crowds rather than standing out from them. What could someone like Leonard see in someone like me? The question followed me through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, circling my thoughts like a persistent mosquito that couldn't be ignored or swatted away. I tried to distract myself with sketching, but every attempt at drawing something other than Leonard's face felt forced and unsatisfying. Finally, I gave up and went for a walk through the neighborhood, hoping the familiar streets would restore some sense of normalcy to my increasingly chaotic thoughts. I found myself heading toward the small park that sat at the heart of our residential complex, a patch of green space with walking paths, a playground that saw most of its use on weekends, and a scattering of benches positioned to catch the best light at different times of day. It was one of my favorite places to sketch, quiet enough for solitude but with enough foot traffic to provide interesting subjects if I was in the mood for people watching. The park was nearly empty in the early evening light, just a few joggers taking advantage of the cooler temperatures and an older woman walking a small dog that seemed more interested in sniffing every blade of grass than actually exercising. I chose my usual bench, positioned to overlook the small pond that served as the park's centerpiece, and pulled out my sketchbook. I'd been drawing for maybe 20 minutes when I heard footsteps on the path behind me. Something made me look up. Maybe some sixth sense or maybe just curiosity, and my breath caught when I saw Leonard approaching along the winding walkway. He was dressed more casually than he'd been that morning, khakis and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, but he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had caught my attention at the grocery store. When he spotted me on the bench, his face lit up with surprise and what looked like genuine pleasure. "Owen," he said, changing direction to approach my bench. "What are the odds?" "Leonard." My voice came out slightly breathless, like I'd been the one jogging instead of sitting still for the better part of half an hour. "I was just sketching. Mind if I take a look?" He gestured toward my sketchbook, and I realized I'd been drawing the pond with its small fountain and the way the early evening light caught the water droplets in midair. I handed him the book, hyper-aware of his fingers brushing mine as he took it. Leonard studied my drawing with the kind of focused attention that artists dream of receiving but rarely get. His eyes moving across the page like he was trying to understand not just what I'd drawn, but why I'd chosen to draw it that way. "This is remarkable," he said finally, looking up to meet my eyes. "You've captured something I walk past every day but never really see." "It's nothing special," I said automatically, the self-deprecation so ingrained it came out before I could stop it. "I disagree." Leonard handed the sketchbook back to me, but he didn't move to leave. "Mind if I sit?" "I don't want to interrupt if you're in the middle of something important." "Please." I scooted over to make room for him on the bench, suddenly grateful that I'd chosen one of the larger ones. "I was just killing time." Leonard settled beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. For a moment, neither of us spoke, just sat together watching the fountain send up its steady spray of water while joggers and dog walkers moved along the paths around us. "Do you come here often?" Leonard asked eventually. "Most evenings when the weather's decent." "It's quiet. Good light for drawing." I glanced over at him. "What about you? I've never seen you here before." "I usually take a different route home from work. But tonight I felt like taking the long way around." There was something in his voice that made me think the decision hadn't been entirely random. I'm glad I did. The statement hung between us, loaded with implication that neither of us seemed quite ready to address directly. I found myself studying Leonard's profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way the fading sunlight brought out the silver in his hair. He was handsome in a way that was understated but undeniable, the kind of attractiveness that came from good bone structure and the confidence that developed over years of learning who you were and being comfortable with it. "Can I ask you something?" Leonard's voice interrupted my silent inventory of his features. "Sure. This morning, when you were making my coffee, you seemed... I don't know how to put this without sounding presumptuous." He turned to face me more fully, and I was struck by the sincerity in his eyes. "You seemed like you were enjoying having someone to talk to. Like maybe you don't get many opportunities for real conversation." The observation was so accurate it made my chest tighten. Is it that obvious? Only because I recognize the feeling. Leonard's smile was rueful, tinged with something that might have been loneliness, I spend most of my days in meetings talking about market demographics and brand positioning, surrounded by people but having conversations that don't really mean anything. And then I go home to an empty apartment and realize I haven't had a real connection with another person in longer than I want to admit. His honesty caught me off guard, creating an opening for the kind of vulnerability I usually avoided. I know what you mean. I talk to dozens of people every day at the coffee shop, but it's all surface-level stuff. Order, payment, have a nice day, rinse and repeat. Exactly. Leonard leaned back against the bench, his shoulder brushing against mine. And after a while, you start to forget what it feels like to have someone actually listen when you talk, or to be interested in what they have to say beyond just being polite. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the light fade from the sky as evening settled around us. The fountain continued its steady rhythm, and I found myself synchronizing my breathing to its gentle splash. Leonard's presence beside me felt natural in a way that surprised me, like we'd been sitting together on park benches for years instead of having known each other for less than 24 hours. "What kind of marketing do you do?" I asked eventually, curious about the life he led during those long downtown hours. "Corporate consulting mostly. Companies hire us when they want to rebrand or launch new products, figure out how to reach their target demographics." Leonard's tone suggested this wasn't his favorite topic of conversation. "It pays well, but some days I feel like I'm speaking a language that doesn't have anything to do with real human connection." "That sounds lonely." "It is." The admission came out quietly, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. "I used to love what I did, back when I started." There's something satisfying about helping a business figure out how to tell their story in a way that resonates with people. But somewhere along the way, it became more about data points and focus groups than actual storytelling. I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the rare vulnerability in his voice. "How long have you been doing it?" 15 years. Started right out of grad school, worked my way up to senior partner." Leonard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The American dream, right? Corner office, 6-figure salary, respect from my peers, everything I thought I wanted when I was your age. But success isn't the same thing as satisfaction." He turned to look at me, and there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Lately, I've been wondering what it would feel like to have conversations that mattered again. To spend time with someone who sees the world differently than I do, who could remind me why I used to care about things like beauty and creativity and human connection. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy with implication. I felt like he was offering me something precious and fragile, a glimpse into parts of himself that he didn't share casually. The smart thing would be to make some polite response and change the subject to something safer, less loaded with possibility and risk. Instead, I heard myself saying, "I'd like that too." Leonard's eyes searched my face, looking for something I hoped he'd find there. "Would you? Even with someone old enough to be your father?" The question hung in the air between us, acknowledging the elephant that had been lurking at the edges of our conversation. Leonard was older than me, significantly older, and under normal circumstances that might have been a barrier I wouldn't have known how to cross. But sitting beside him in the fading light, feeling the warmth of his presence and the genuine interest in his voice, age felt like just another arbitrary boundary that didn't have to define what was possible between us. "You're not old enough to be my father," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "And even if you were, I don't think that would matter as much as people pretend it does." Leonard's smile was slow and warm, transforming his entire face in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You might be right about that." The silence that followed felt charged with possibility, electric in a way that made me hyper-aware of every point of contact between us. His shoulder against mine, the way his hand rested on the bench just inches from my own, the rhythm of his breathing in the quiet evening air. I found myself cataloging details I wanted to remember later. The way the dying light caught the silver threads in his hair, the small scar just above his left eyebrow that I hadn't noticed before, the way his fingers tapped an absent rhythm against the wooden bench. "I should probably head home," Leonard said eventually, but he made no move to get up. "Early morning tomorrow." "Me too." I closed my sketchbook and slipped it into my bag, already dreading the moment when this unexpected encounter would end. "Will I see you at the coffee shop?" "I was hoping you'd ask." Leonard stood up slowly, like he was as reluctant as I was to break the spell of the evening. "Same time?" "I'll be there." We walked together toward the edge of the park, our steps automatically slowing as we approached the place where our paths would diverge. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of early summer flowers and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. Everything felt heightened somehow, more vivid and significant than ordinary moments usually did. At the park entrance, Leonard paused and turned to face me. The streetlights had come on while we were talking, casting everything in a warm amber glow that made the moment feel cinematic, like a scene from one of those independent films about lonely people finding unexpected connections in the midst of their carefully ordered lives. "Owen," he said, and something in his voice made me look up to meet his eyes. "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to have a real conversation with someone." Leonard's smile was soft, almost shy. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it. The sincerity in his voice made my chest feel tight with emotion I wasn't quite ready to name. "Thank you for stopping to help with my groceries, and for coming to the coffee shop, and for sitting with me tonight. My pleasure." Leonard hesitated for a moment, like he was weighing his words carefully. "I hope this doesn't sound too forward, but would you maybe like to have dinner sometime? Somewhere we could actually talk without worrying about customers or closing time?" The invitation hung between us, simple words that felt loaded with possibility and risk in equal measure. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to leap into whatever this was developing into without overthinking the complications. But another part of me was terrified by how much I wanted to say yes, how much Leonard's attention already meant to me after less than a day of knowing him. "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the butterflies rioting in my stomach. "Good." Leonard's smile was radiant, lighting up his entire face in a way that made me forget about age differences and the wisdom of getting involved with someone I barely knew. "I'll think of somewhere nice. Somewhere worthy of the occasion." We said goodbye at the park entrance, Leonard heading toward Building C while I turned toward Building B. I found myself walking more slowly than usual, savoring the lingering warmth of his presence and the memory of how he'd looked at me when I'd agreed to dinner. Like I was something precious, something worth taking care with. My apartment felt different when I let myself in, charged with anticipation in a way that made it impossible to settle into my usual evening routine. I tried sketching, but my hands were too restless to create anything worthwhile. I tried reading, but the words wouldn't stick in my mind long enough to form coherent thoughts. Finally, I gave up and went to bed early, lying in the darkness and replaying every moment of the evening until I fell asleep with Leonard's voice echoing in my memory. The next morning arrived with unusual brightness, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window in a way that made even my modest apartment look warm and inviting. I went through my morning routine with more energy than I'd felt in months, taking extra care with my appearance in a way that I told myself was completely unrelated to the fact that Leonard would be coming to the coffee shop. The morning rush seemed to pass more quickly than usual, each customer bringing me closer. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to. The words float between us like a question mark suspended in the amber light of his living room. Thomas, I finally learned his name during our afternoon of shared groceries and careful conversation, sits on the edge of his leather couch, hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles have gone white. The vulnerability in his voice cuts through me like a blade, sharp and clean and impossible to ignore. I'm standing by his front door, my hand still resting on the brass handle that feels cold despite the warmth radiating from somewhere deep in my chest. Outside, the October rain has intensified into something more serious. Fat droplets painting diagonal streaks across his windows, the kind of storm that makes you grateful to be indoors with someone who might understand the weather in your heart. The word catches in my throat like a fishbone. I turn to face him fully, taking in the careful way he's arranged himself on the couch, as if he's trying to appear casual while his entire body vibrates with nervous energy. His salt and pepper hair catches the light from the table lamp beside him, and I notice for the first time how his green sweater brings out flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Eyes that are watching me with a mixture of hope and terror that makes my ribs feel too small for my lungs. The silence stretches between us, filled with all the things we haven't said and might never find the courage to voice. I can hear the rain drumming against the roof with increasing urgency, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbles like the earth clearing its throat before speaking some fundamental truth. "The weather's getting worse," he adds quietly, and we both know it's an excuse. My apartment is only 10 minutes away, and I've driven in far worse conditions. But excuses are sometimes the kindest way to offer what we're too afraid to ask for directly. I let my hand fall away from the door handle. The small sound it makes as it clicks back into place seems to echo through the room with the weight of a decision that will change everything, though I don't understand that yet. I only know that the thought of leaving him alone in this beautiful, empty house makes something twist painfully behind my sternum. "Okay," I hear myself say, my voice smaller than I intended. "I'll stay for a while." The relief that washes over his face is so profound it's almost physical, like watching someone who's been holding their breath for years finally allow themselves to exhale. He runs a hand through his hair, disturbing the careful arrangement, and I find myself wanting to smooth it back into place. "Thank you," he says, so quietly I almost miss it. "I mean, the storm, thank you." I walk back toward the living room, but instead of returning to the armchair where I'd been sitting earlier, I find myself gravitating toward the opposite end of his couch, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but far enough to maintain the pretense that this is still just neighbors being neighborly. The leather cushions sigh softly as I settle in, and suddenly I'm hyper-aware of every small sound, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the rhythm of our breathing that seems too loud in the quiet room, the distant rumble of thunder growing steadily closer. Would you like something to drink?" He's already starting to rise, eager for something to do with his hands, somewhere to direct the nervous energy that's practically crackling between us. "Coffee? Tea? I think I have some wine." "Tea sounds perfect," I say, grateful for the reprieve. If it's not too much trouble. No trouble at all. He disappears into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the weight of my decision and the growing awareness that staying means more than just waiting out the storm. I can hear him moving around, the soft clink of china against china, the whistle of the kettle building to its crescendo, the gentle rattle of spoons in a drawer. Domestic sounds that paint pictures in my mind of what his evenings usually look like. Does he make tea for one while standing at the counter, too tired or too lonely to bother with the ritual of setting a proper table? Does he eat dinner with the television on for company, or does he prefer the honest silence? When he returns, carrying a wooden tray with 2 steaming mugs and a small plate of what look like homemade cookies, I notice the slight tremor in his hands. It could be the weight of the tray, but something tells me it's nerves. The same nerves that are making my stomach flutter like I'm 16 again and sitting next to my crush in algebra class. "Chamomile," he says, setting the tray down on the coffee table between us. "I hope that's all right. It's supposed to be calming." Perfect, I assure him, wrapping my fingers around the warm ceramic and letting the steam rise between us like incense. The mug is handmade, I realize, slightly imperfect in the way that speaks of human hands rather than factory precision. Did you make these? He follows my gaze to the mug and color rises in his cheeks. It's a hobby. Was a hobby. I haven't thrown pottery in years. Why not? He's quiet for a moment, staring down at his own mug as if it holds the answer to some cosmic question. I suppose life got in the way. Work, responsibilities, all the things you're supposed to prioritize as an adult. There's something in his voice, a wistfulness that speaks of dreams deferred so long they've almost fossilized. I want to ask more, but the careful way he's holding himself tells me we're approaching territory that might be too tender to touch, at least not yet. We drink our tea in companionable silence, and I find myself studying his profile as he gazes out at the storm. The lines around his eyes speak of laughter and worry in equal measure, and there's something achingly beautiful about the way the lamplight catches the silver threading through his dark hair. He holds his mug with both hands, like he's drawing comfort from its warmth, and I notice that his fingers are long and elegant, artists' hands that have been forced into other shapes by necessity and expectation. I used to love storms when I was younger, he says suddenly, his voice soft and contemplative. I'd sit by my bedroom window and count the seconds between lightning and thunder, trying to calculate how close the storm was getting. What changed? He's quiet for so long I think he might not answer. When he finally speaks, his words come out barely above a whisper. Storms are different when you experience them alone. They're not exciting anymore, they're just loud. The honesty in his admission hits me like a physical blow. I want to reach out to close the distance between us and offer some small comfort, but I don't know if I'm allowed. We're still strangers, really, despite the odd intimacy that's developed between us over these past few hours. Still, there's something about the way he said it, not looking for pity, just stating a simple, devastating truth that makes my heart clench with recognition. I know that feeling, I say quietly. The alone part. He turns to look at me then, and I feel exposed under his gentle scrutiny. Do you? You seem like someone who would have people around. Friends, family. I let out a laugh that holds no humor. Having people around and not feeling alone are two completely different things. Yes, he says simply, and the understanding in that single word makes something tight in my chest begin to loosen. They are. Another stretch of silence settles between us, but this time it feels different, less awkward, more companionable, like we're two people who have found themselves in the same lifeboat and are finally acknowledging that we're floating in the same vast, uncertain ocean. The storm outside is building in earnest now, and with each flash of lightning, the room is briefly illuminated in stark black and white before returning to the warm, golden glow of the lamps. During one particularly bright flash, I catch him looking at me with an expression I can't quite decipher, something between curiosity and longing, as if he's trying to solve a puzzle he's not sure he's allowed to work on. "Can I ask you something?" he says, setting his mug down on the coffee table and turning his body more fully toward me. "Of course. What are you running from?" The question catches me completely off guard. I open my mouth to protest, to ask what he means, but the words die before they can form, because somehow, impossibly, he's seen right through me. Seen past the careful small talk and polite distance to the truth I've been trying to hide from myself. I ... I start, then stop. How can I explain it? How can I tell him about the crushing weight of everyone's expectations, about the life I'm supposed to want but don't, about the growing certainty that I'm living someone else's dream while my own remains buried so deep I've almost forgotten what it looks like? "I'm sorry," he says quickly, seeing my struggle. "That was too personal. I shouldn't have." "No," I interrupt, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "It's okay. I just..." I don't know how to put it into words. He waits, patient and still, like someone who has learned the value of silence. Outside, the wind picks up, sending tree branches scratching against the windows with desperate, grasping fingers. I feel like I'm sleepwalking through my life, I say finally, the words tumbling out in a rush, like I'm going through all the motions, work, friends, dating, all the things you're supposed to do, but none of it feels real. None of it feels like mine, if that makes sense. He nods slowly, and something in his expression tells me it makes perfect sense to him. It does, he says. It makes complete sense. Does it? I laugh, but there's no joy in the sound. Because most of the time I feel like I'm going crazy. Like I'm the only person in the world who looks around and thinks, is this it? Is this really all there is? You're not crazy, he says, and the certainty in his voice makes something tight in my chest begin to unknot. And you're definitely not the only one. I look at him, really look at him, and see my own lost expression reflected back at me. You feel it too. It's not a question. Every single day, he admits. The sleepwalking. The sense that life is happening to someone else while I watch from behind glass. How do you stand it? The question comes out more desperate than I intended, but I can't take it back now. He's quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands where they rest on his knees. When he speaks again, his voice is barely audible above the storm. Most days, I don't know how. I get up. I go through the motions. I tell myself that this is what adult life is supposed to feel like. That everyone else has figured out some secret I'm still missing. But some days, he looks up at me, and in his eyes I see something that makes my breath catch. Hope. Fragile and flickering like a candle flame in a drafty room, but unmistakably there. Some days, something unexpected happens. A neighbor asks for help with groceries, or a stranger smiles at you on the street, and suddenly the world feels possible again. The weight of his words settles between us like a living thing. I can feel my heart beginning to race as I realize what he's really saying, what we're both dancing around with our careful metaphors and safe distances. Thomas, I say softly, using his name for the first time since he told it to me hours ago. It feels strange on my tongue, intimate in a way that makes warmth bloom low in my belly. Yes? I'm glad I stayed. Something shifts in his expression, surprise giving way to something warmer, more vulnerable. The careful mask he's been wearing all evening finally begins to slip, revealing something raw and real underneath. I'm glad you stayed too, Jamie. Hearing him say my name sends a shiver down my spine that has nothing to do with the storm outside. The way he says it, soft and careful, like he's testing how it feels in his mouth, makes me acutely aware of the space between us on the couch. It suddenly seems both too far and not nearly far enough. The lights flicker as a particularly strong gust of wind shakes the house, and in that moment of uncertainty, I find myself shifting closer to him without conscious thought. Not touching, but close enough that I can smell his cologne, something warm and woody that makes me want to lean in further. The power might go out, he observes, but he makes no move to find candles or flashlights. Instead, he's looking at me with an intensity that makes my skin tingle with awareness. Would that be so terrible? I ask, surprising myself with my boldness. No, he says quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. I don't think it would be. Another flash of lightning illuminates the room, and in that brief moment of stark clarity, I see him as if for the first time. Not as my neighbor, not as some mysterious older man, but as Thomas. Just Thomas, lonely and hoping and beautiful in his quiet, understated way, sitting close enough to touch, but still somehow just out of reach. When the darkness returns, it seems deeper than before, more intimate. The storm is directly overhead now, and each crack of thunder makes us both startle slightly, then share a quiet laugh at our own jumpiness. But I notice that with each startling moment, we seem to drift closer together, like ships seeking shelter in the same harbor. "I should probably check the windows," he says, but he makes no move to get up. "Make sure they're all properly latched." "Probably," I agree, also not moving. We sit there in our mutual inertia, both of us aware that checking the windows is just another excuse, another way to avoid acknowledging what's really happening in the charged space between us. The air in the room feels electric in a way that has nothing to do with the storm outside. "Jamie?" His voice is so soft I almost miss it over the drumming rain. "Yeah? Do you ever wonder if—" He stops, frustrated with his inability to find the right words. I turn to face him fully, drawing one leg up onto the couch so I can look at him properly. In the dim light, his face is all shadows and planes, achingly beautiful in its vulnerability. "Wonder if what?" He's quiet for so long I think he might not answer. When he finally speaks, his words come out in a rush, as if he has to say them quickly or lose his nerve entirely. "If there's something fundamentally broken in me, for feeling this way, for wanting things I'm not supposed to want." My heart stops, then starts again at double time. The careful distance we've been maintaining suddenly feels like a chasm that needs to be crossed. "What do you want, Thomas?" The question hangs in the air between us, loaded with possibilities and fraught with the potential for everything to change. I watch as he struggles with his answer, his hands clasping and unclasping in his lap, his eyes searching my face for some sign of how I might react. "I want to stop pretending," he says finally. "I want to stop being so careful all the time, so afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing that I end up saying and doing nothing at all. I want—" He pauses, takes a shaky breath. "I want to matter to someone. Really matter. Not just as a colleague or a neighbor or whatever role I'm supposed to play, but as myself. As who I really am underneath all the expectations and obligations." The raw honesty in his voice nearly undoes me. Without thinking, I reach out and cover one of his restless hands with mine. The contact is electric, the first time we've truly touched, and I feel him go very still beneath my palm. "There's nothing broken about you," I say firmly, my thumb brushing across his knuckles. "Nothing at all." He stares down at our joined hands as if he can't quite believe it's real. "I'm 45 years old, Jamie." I should have figured this out by now. I should know who I am and what I want and how to— "Stop," I say gently, squeezing his hand. "Just stop. Age doesn't come with a manual for happiness. Nobody has it all figured out, no matter how old they are or how together they seem from the outside." "Don't they?" He looks up at me, and I see decades of self-doubt and carefully buried dreams in his brown eyes. Because sometimes I feel like I've wasted so much time trying to be what everyone else needed me to be that I've completely lost track of who I actually am underneath it all. I understand that feeling so completely it makes my chest ache with recognition. Then maybe it's time to start figuring it out. The real you, I mean. What if the real me is someone people can't accept? What if— I silence him by moving closer, close enough that our knees are almost touching, close enough that I can see the flecks of gold in his eyes and count the laugh lines that speak of a life lived, even if it hasn't always been lived authentically. "Then those people don't deserve you," I say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone who can't accept the real you isn't worth your time or your worry." Something in his expression cracks open then, like a dam that's been holding back years of accumulated pressure. His free hand comes up to touch my cheek, hesitant at first, fingers barely grazing my skin as if he's afraid I might evaporate at too firm a touch. "You're so young," he murmurs, but there's no rejection in his voice. If anything, He sounds awed, as if he can't quite believe I'm real, can't quite believe this moment is happening. I'm 28, Thomas. I'm not a child. I know, he says quickly. I know that. It's just, I never imagined. I never let myself imagine that someone like you would look at someone like me and see something worth... Worth what? I prompt gently, leaning slightly into his touch. Worth wanting, he finishes, so quietly I have to strain to hear him over the storm. The pain in his voice, the years of loneliness and self-doubt packed into those two words, makes something crack open in my chest. How long has he been telling himself that story? How many years has he spent believing that he wasn't worthy of love, wasn't worth choosing, wasn't enough exactly as he is? I do, I say simply, turning my head to press a soft kiss to his palm. I do see something worth wanting. His breath catches, and I watch as wonder and disbelief war across his features. His thumb traces the line of my cheekbone with reverent care, as if he's memorizing the texture of my skin. Jamie, he whispers, my name a prayer on his lips. It's okay, I murmur, though I'm not entirely sure what I'm reassuring him about. The feelings building between us? The way the world seems to have narrowed down to just this moment? Just the two of us and the storm outside? The terrifying, exhilarating step we're both contemplating? Is it? He asks, vulnerability making his voice rough around the edges. Because I don't know the rules here. I don't know how this works or what I'm supposed to do or... I silence him by covering his hand with both of mine, pressing his palm more firmly against my cheek. There are no rules. There's just us, right now, in this moment. That's all we need to worry about. He stares at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if looking for some sign that this is real, that he's not dreaming, that I won't disappear the moment he blinks. Then, slowly, carefully, as if he's afraid sudden movement might shatter whatever spell has settled over us, he leans closer. The first brush of his lips against mine is feather light, more question than statement. I can taste the chamomile tea on his breath, can feel the slight tremor in his hand where it still cups my face. When I don't pull away, when I instead lean into the kiss and let my eyes flutter closed, I feel him exhale against my mouth like he's been holding his breath for decades. The second kiss is deeper, more sure. His other hand finds the back of my neck, fingers tangling in my hair as he pulls me closer. I go willingly, my own hands fisting in the soft wool of his sweater as if I need to anchor myself to this moment, to him, to the reality of what's happening between us. It's everything I'd imagined during those stolen glances across our adjoining backyards and nothing like I'd expected all at once. There's desperation in the way he kisses me. Years of loneliness and want poured into this single point of connection. But there's also reverence, as if he's handling something precious and fragile that might break if he holds on too tightly. When we finally break apart, both of us breathing hard, he rests his forehead against mine and closes his eyes. I can't believe this is real, he whispers. Are you okay with it being real? I ask, suddenly needing the reassurance, needing to know that I haven't misread every signal, every careful word and lingering glance. His eyes open, meeting mine, and what I see there makes my heart skip a beat. Wonder. Joy. And underneath it all, a bone-deep contentment that I recognize because I feel it too, like something that's been out of alignment for years has finally clicked into place. More than okay, he says. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I know exactly what he means. The restless, sleepwalking feeling we'd talked about earlier has evaporated completely, replaced by a hyper-awareness of everything. The storm outside, the warmth of his skin beneath my hands, The way his sweater has ridden up slightly to reveal a strip of stomach that makes my mouth go dry with want. The sound of our breathing in the suddenly quiet room. "Come here," he says softly, tugging gently on my hands. I let him pull me closer until I'm half curled against his side, my head resting on his shoulder and one hand splayed across his chest where I can feel his heart beating fast and strong beneath my palm. He wraps his arms around me, one hand stroking slowly through my hair, and I think I've never felt safer or more wanted in my entire life. We stay like that as the storm rages outside, neither of us speaking, just breathing together and marveling at how perfectly we seem to fit. His fingers trace idle patterns on my arm, and I find myself pressing small kisses to his collarbone through the soft wool of his sweater, tasting the salt of his skin and the lingering scent of his cologne. "I should probably call in sick tomorrow," he says eventually, his voice rumbling through his chest. "Should you?" I ask, though I desperately hope he will. "I don't want this to end. I don't want you to leave, and for both of us to pretend this never happened, to go back to being polite strangers who wave at each other across the yard." I tilt my head up to look at him. "Is that what you think will happen?" "I don't know," he admits. "I've never done anything like this before." "What, stayed up during a storm?" That earns me a soft laugh, and I feel the vibration of it against my cheek. "You know what I mean." I do know. I know he's talking about the kissing, the touching, the way we're wrapped around each other on his couch like lovers instead of neighbors. I know he's talking about the terrifying, wonderful step we've taken into completely uncharted territory. "I've never done this either," I tell him. "Not really. Not like this. No." I shake my head against his shoulder. "I've been with people before, but never anyone who mattered this much. Never someone I actually wanted to wake up next to." His arms tighten around me slightly. "You want to wake up next to me?" "I want to wake up next to you," I confirm, surprised by how certain I sound, how right it feels to say it out loud. "If you want that too." "Jamie." He says my name like it's something sacred, something to be treasured. "Of course I want that. The question is whether you'll still want it when morning comes, and you remember that I'm just your confused, middle-aged neighbor who doesn't have any idea what he's doing." I push up on my elbow so I can look him in the eye properly. "Stop that. Stop talking about yourself like you're pathetic or hopeless or whatever cruel story you've been telling yourself. You're not confused. You're brave. Do you have any idea how much courage it took to ask me to stay tonight? To let me see the real you instead of the careful mask you wear for the rest of the world?" "It doesn't feel brave," he says quietly. "It feels terrifying." That's exactly what makes it brave. I smooth my hand across his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared, but you do it anyway. He stares up at me for a long moment, and I watch as something shifts in his expression, self-doubt giving way to something that looks almost like hope. "When did you get so wise?" he asks, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "Probably around the same time you decided to trust me enough to let me stay." He pulls me down for another kiss, slower this time, deeper, like he's trying to memorize the taste of me. When we break apart, he presses his lips to my forehead and holds me there. "I don't want this night to end," he whispers against my skin. "Then let's not let it end." "Not yet." We settle back into our embrace, and I listen as his breathing gradually evens out, feel the tension leave his body as exhaustion and contentment combine to pull him toward sleep. The couch isn't really big enough for both of us, but somehow we make it work, with me curled against his side and his arms around me, a soft throw blanket pulled over both of us. The storm is beginning to move on now, the thunder growing more distant and the rain gentling to a soft patter against the windows. But I'm not ready for it to end. Not ready to return to a world where everything is uncertain and complicated. Here, in the warm circle of Thomas's arms, with his heartbeat steady beneath my ear and his fingers tracing gentle patterns on my back, everything feels possible. "Thank you," he says quietly into the darkness. "For what?" "For staying. For seeing something in me worth staying for making me feel like maybe I'm not invisible after all." I press a kiss to the hollow of his throat. "Thank you for asking me to stay. For trusting me with who you really are." "I was terrified you'd say no." "I was terrified you were just being polite." We both laugh softly at the absurdity of it, two people so afraid of rejection that we'd nearly missed this entirely. "We're both terrible at this," he murmurs, his voice already thick with approaching sleep. "At what?" "At believing we deserve good things." The truth of it settles over us like another blanket, warm and heavy and oddly comforting. Maybe we are terrible at it. Maybe we've both spent so many years convincing ourselves that we don't deserve love or happiness or connection that we've almost forgotten how to accept it when it's offered. But lying here in the dark, listening to the storm gentle into ordinary rain, I think maybe we can learn. Maybe we can teach each other that we are worthy of tenderness, worthy of being chosen, worthy of waking up together and seeing what tomorrow might bring. I must drift off at some point, because the next thing I'm aware of is the soft gray light of early dawn filtering through the windows and the sound of birds beginning to tentatively sing in the aftermath of the storm. Thomas is still asleep beneath me, his breathing deep and even, one arm still wrapped protectively around my waist. For a moment, I just lie there and listen to him breathe, marveling at how different everything feels in the morning light. I'd expected to wake up with regrets, with second thoughts and the awkward scramble to figure out what comes next. Instead, I feel peaceful, complete in a way I haven't experienced in years, maybe ever. Thomas stirs slightly, his arm tightening around me before his eyes flutter open. When he sees me watching him, a slow smile spreads across his face that transforms his entire expression, erasing years of careful guardedness and revealing the man I glimpsed in fleeting moments throughout our long night of conversation and confession. "Good morning," he says, his voice rough with sleep but warm with contentment. "Good morning," I reply, unable to keep from smiling back. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," he admits, reaching up to touch my face as if he needs to confirm that I'm real, that this isn't just some elaborate dream his loneliness conjured up. "You?" "The same." We stay like that for a while, just looking at each other in the soft morning light, both of us seeming to understand that we've crossed a line in the darkness that there's no going back over. The question now is where we go from here, how we navigate this fragile new thing we've built between us. "Jamie," Thomas says eventually, his voice careful in the way of someone who's about to ask for something important. "Yeah? I know this is all new and I know it's complicated and I don't want to pressure you or assume anything just because of what happened between us last night. But," I prompt when he trails off, though I think I know where he's heading, and I find myself hoping desperately that I'm right. "But I was wondering if maybe, would you like to have breakfast with me? I make decent pancakes and I have real maple syrup and I just..." He pauses, vulnerability flickering across his features. "I'm not ready for you to leave yet. I'm not ready for this to turn into something that only happened in the dark." The hope in his voice, carefully tempered by the very real fear of rejection, makes my heart turn over in my chest. I lean down and kiss him softly, tasting morning and possibility and the promise of something real beginning to take shape between us. "I would love to have breakfast with you," I say against his lips. "But I should probably call my office first. Let them know I won't be in today." "Are you sure? I don't want you to get in trouble because of me." I kiss him again, longer this time, trying to pour all my certainty into the connection between us. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As I reach for my phone to make the call, I catch sight of the world outside his living room windows. The storm has washed everything clean, leaving behind a landscape that sparkles with raindrops and morning light. The sun is breaking through the dispersing clouds, painting everything in shades of gold and hope and new beginnings. It feels like a metaphor for something. For us, maybe. For the way we weathered our own internal storms together and emerged changed, cleaner somehow, more ourselves than we'd been before the rain started falling. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how we'll navigate this thing between us, or what it will look like in the bright light of ordinary days, or whether we'll be able to build something lasting from the foundation we've laid in one perfect, storm-swept night. But for the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm not afraid of the uncertainty. For the first time in years, the future feels like something to anticipate rather than endure. And as Thomas smiles at me in the golden morning light, his hair mussed from sleep and his eyes bright with possibility, I realize that this is what hope feels like. This warm, expanding thing in my chest that whispers maybe the best parts of our lives are still ahead of us, waiting to be discovered together. The storm has passed, but something new is just beginning.